bulletin, we are planning on picking back up in the book of Hebrews here, chapter 11, starting in verse 17. Back where we left off, Pastor Tanner and I have been alternating here in the sermons here, and we've been going through the book of Hebrews, picking back up where Pastor Woodrick had left off. So if you want to go ahead and turn there, and I just want to kind of give you a little bit of a warning. I'm expecting us to do a lot of flipping back through the Bible in the book of Genesis as well. So as we continue on here and just going back through and taking a look at the accounts here of these different Old Testament saints. Of course, you remember here the larger context of the book of Hebrews, the audience that this book was originally intended for. Is there a mic on? Another mic on, maybe? Thank you. The main sort of doctrinal statement that is being made in Hebrews about who Jesus is and this better high priest, this better covenant, these established on better promises. And the main exhortation that we see in the book of Hebrews is to persist in the faith and to not turn away from the faith. And we saw that statement being made at the end of chapter 10 from Habakkuk, the just shall live by faith. And now in Hebrews 11, we're going through these Old Testament saints and these different examples of this faith. And again, what we're seeing here is not something new. The original audience of this book, who were Jews, as we understand through the Bible here, there was this notion or idea that existed in those days that salvation could be attained by the deeds of the law. We saw that in the book of Romans, where Paul bears witness that they were seeking to establish their own righteousness through the deeds of the law and not rather submitting themselves to the righteousness of God, which is by faith. And so there was this idea going around, and we see here in chapter 11 certainly that even though that idea was around, that was not the reality. They were very familiar with the Old Testament, and the author here is recounting how salvation by faith was the means all along ago, all that time ago. And we've gone through and we've looked through some of these Old Testament saints already, and we've been seeing that they have faith, of course. We've also been seeing a little bit of differences and similarities here, some nuance of aspects of their faith, the different decisions that they made and conclusions that they had come to, the different good works that resulted from their faith here. And we see some similarity to their faith and ours today. Some similarity to those works that were a result of that faith, and likewise a similarity to ours today. It was a little while ago I was preaching through James chapter 2, and we were dealing with that issue of faith and works. And we saw there that those things are integral. There is a sense in which they are integral. That is, that faith is the root and works are the fruit, right? And so this idea that they're only alternatives. Either you have faith without works, or you have works without faith, and there's no way in which they're integrated, is not actually true. We are saved only by faith, but that faith will necessarily produce works, and that's what we see here. Remember, James says, show me your faith without your works, I'll show you my faith by my works. Well, how can we see these Old Testament saints' faith but by their works? And so that is what is being described here. It's the means by which we can examine our own selves and look and see the genuineness of our faith by our works. There was two examples given in James there about one about Abraham when he offered Isaac his son, and then Rahab when she had received the spies. And we see those two examples given here in this chapter as well. And that's where we're picking back up with Abraham, where he offered Isaac his son. We also see in these different examples the cost of a lot of these Old Testament's faith. The sacrifice that they were willing to pay because of their faith. And we see some similarities there as well. Picking back up in verse 17, it says here that by faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. When I was going through James, we went back to Genesis chapter 22. We looked through that passage there, and we saw the account there that is given in Genesis of Abraham being tried and offering up his son. And what a picture. I mean, there are pictures of Christ, figures and types and prophecies, so much in the Old Testament. And some of them are just like, how can you not see it? This is one of those passages where we see it so clearly, what is going on. And it's so funny. You think back in those days with Abraham, probably not really even having any idea as to what was going on there. God asking him, telling him to sacrifice your son. And the reasons behind all this, the purpose of God that we see in these passages that existed all the way then, and how God, who does not change hundreds of years later, then fulfills that in sending his son, his only begotten son, and sacrificing him on the very same mountain that he told Abraham to sacrifice his son. Putting the wood on him and him bearing it up. Providing that sacrifice. Amazing. What a clear example of it. We see here in Hebrews, it says here that it was by faith that Abraham did this. And it says here it was when he was tried. When he was tried. When we go back to Genesis chapter 22, we see there that it says God tried him. God tested him. And this is something that is a reality for us. That faith at times comes under trial. And it's not apart from God's plan. God can have purpose and intention in sending us trials that test our faith. God is pleased to give faith, and he's pleased to then try those whom he's given that faith to, and to prove, to demonstrate its genuineness, its endurance. He is glorified in that. Here he is with Abraham. And what's amazing about this is the very nature of this trial, how it had to do with the very promise that was given him, that we saw earlier that Abraham believed. That promise that was that Abrahamic covenant, and the promise that ultimately was referring to Christ, who was that seed in whom all the families, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And particularly Isaac. You remember the story about how Abraham is wondering, okay, how is God going to do this? Sarah's barren. They have this discussion, and Sarah says, well, perhaps you take Hagar, my maid. Perhaps that's how God's going to do this. And then we find out later, God says, no, it's going to be in Sarah. And he says it'll be in Isaac shall thy seed be called. He was the child that God had promised this covenant to. And that's what's being referred to here in Hebrews. He that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. We see something about this trial that is given to Abraham's faith. It's what God is commanding him seems to go against what God had promised him. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. As we keep our minds focused on those precious promises that he's given to us, there are times, perhaps, where the very things God has told us to do may seem to be very contrary to what he's promised us. How does our faith stand? Does it meet the test? Does it endure? Does it, as Abraham, who is being shown as an example here, does it obey? In light of the seeming contradiction, does it obey? Trials of faith are a reality for us. In 1 Peter, we read a little bit about that. 1 Peter, it says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which according to his abundant mercy hath begotten us again unto a lively hope by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead." If you remember earlier on in Hebrews 11, it was giving that definition of faith. The substance of things hoped for. Here in 1 Peter, we are told that there is a lively hope that we are born again to by the resurrection of Christ from the dead. This is an expectation that is to be had that will be found in all those who are believing, who have faith. And the hope is to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for you. And it says here, who are kept by the power of God through faith, unto salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. So we see here the nature of the hope that we have by faith. And then it goes on in 1 Peter to say, wherein ye greatly rejoice, though now for a season, if need be, ye are in heaviness through manifold temptations. And so we're seeing here this idea of our faith being tested. Heaviness that we may in fact find ourselves in if necessary because of our faith. But yet, because of our hope, we greatly rejoice in the midst of that heaviness. And so it continues on in 1 Peter saying that the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. I think about Job and all he went through. He didn't understand what was going on with him. But behind the scenes, it's revealed to us this interaction between God and Satan accusing Job before God, and God saying, have you seen my servant? Have you seen him? Look at him. Look at the integrity here. And Satan says, well, that's because you blessed him. Take it away from him, and then he'll curse you to your face. God knows what's going to happen. Okay, I'll leave it in your hands. Go ahead. Go ahead. Watch what happens. Watch, Satan. Watch what happens to my servant. Watch. In our trials, we may not understand everything, the reasons completely behind it all. But there is an end that God has to work out in those trials. He knows what's going to happen, and there is a purpose for it, that the trial of our faith will be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. There is an end that he has in mind. And what's interesting here, we see in this passage in 1 Peter, it says, whom having not seen ye love, though now ye see him not, yet believing ye rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory. Kind of similar to what we read there in the beginning of chapter 11 in Hebrews, giving that definition of faith. We see the hope being spoken of here in this passage, but we also see, as it says in Hebrews 11, the evidence of things not seen. Now here we see something about how faith operates in the midst of these trials. It doesn't say that there's no heaviness, but it does say that as a result, even though we do not see, we rejoice. We rejoice. And the end of it, the end of our faith, is the salvation of our souls. It's what we have to look forward to. We see something here about Abraham and what he was willing to let go of because of his faith. What faith it was, too. What an example. I think there's a reason why Abraham, out of everyone, is brought up so many times as this example of faith. That he was willing, just to be his son in the first place. But then you add on top of it, he's the son of promise, this miracle child that he's willing to follow through with and sacrifice. I don't think Abraham had any understanding that God was going to, at the last minute, say, okay, hold your hand. Abraham had no idea. He was willing to go through with it. This was faith that was willing to give that up. It's kind of reminiscent of what Jesus said. I think of his words back in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14. Verse 25 says, there were great multitudes with him. And he turned and said to them, if any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whosoever doth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you intending to build a tower sitteth not down first and counteth the cost, whether he have sufficient to finish it? Lest haply after he hath laid the foundation and is not able to finish it, all that behold it begin to mock him, saying, This man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going to make war against another king, sitteth not down first, and consulteth whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is yet a great way off, he sendeth an embassage, and desireth conditions of peace. So likewise, whosoever he be of you, that forsaketh not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple. We see this trial in Abraham. We see also his faith being able to reconcile what seemed to be a contradiction in this promise. Even though he could not see what God was going to do, in that he commanded him to sacrifice his son Isaac, yet what he knew was that promise. And even in that command, he trusted him. His faith was rooted in God's faithfulness and also in God's power. In his power. You know, it's one thing to make a promise, it's another thing to be able to keep it. And sometimes we want to do something. We make promises and we want to follow through, but we're unable to. That's not the case with God. Not only does God intend to keep his word, he is able to keep his word. He's the Almighty. And we see here how Abraham reckoned within himself, how he thought on this seeming contradiction. If God has promised this with Isaac, but yet he's told me to sacrifice, and he's faithful, he will keep his word, then how is that going to play out? He didn't count him a liar. He didn't count him unable to keep that promise. It says that he counted God was able to raise him up even from the dead. Well, if God's going to keep this promise in Isaac, and I'm to kill him, well, I guess he must raise him from the dead then. God's power, his ability to resurrect from the dead. What a similarity there is there with the faith we are to have. Is that not something we're to be trusting in? Not only in what happened to Christ after he died, but for us also. That is what we are hoping in because of our faith. That there will be a resurrection. And it's one of the ways we can overcome the potential suffering we might have to endure in obedience to God. We can continue on in obedience even if it means death, the loss of our own life, because we're trusting in his ability. We have a hope for the future of a resurrection. We see here this figure that Isaac was of Christ. And we see here that this faith Abram had, it says here that from whence also he received him in a figure. I take that to mean Christ. That his faith was demonstrated in God's faithfulness, in his promise, accounting that God could raise him from the dead, which was a figure of Christ. And in effect, it was faith in Christ that Abraham had, though he had not come yet. Again, we see here, this isn't new. This isn't something that happens now in the New Testament. It was the same faith then. Now we move on in Hebrews 11 here from Abraham, and we look at Isaac. I'm going to try and go through here through verses 20 and 22, but what I would like to do is just kind of go back through the Old Testament account and refresh ourselves, kind of picking certain passages here. I picked out certain passages to go back through the book of Genesis, and it spans so much of the book of Genesis, all the way to the end of it. Maybe starting even back in chapter 15, reminding us of some of the promises given to Abraham. Going all the way to chapter 50, we see this story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Huge, huge span of that book there. And I've chosen certain passages out that I would like us to go back over and to take a look at, refresh ourselves, remind ourselves, and to be able to see here this account that is being given of these men and the faith that they had. And it's my prayer that the Holy Spirit would stir us up, that He would strengthen us in our faith, remind us of the faith that God is pointing out in His saints here and the example that they are, so that we would be assured and confident because of the testimony God has given of these Old Testament saints, so that we would persevere, that the joy of the Lord would be our strength, that when we are met with trials, we would continue on, we would be found faithful to the praise and honor and glory of God. So it says here, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. One of the things that, as I was going through this, that I really found seemed to be something, was a common thread here, was this idea of this passing on that happened here. God revealed Himself to Abraham. He gave him promises. And while it's not explicitly stated, what we see revealed to Abraham, we see being spoken by his descendants. And I could only assume that Abraham told Isaac of these things, and then Isaac told Jacob of these things. Well, we do see that. He told Jacob of these things. And Jacob told Joseph of these things. And so we see this passing on of these promises, passing on the faithfulness of God to the next generation. If we want to go ahead and maybe head back to Genesis, and we'll be flipping through Genesis. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 15. Let's start there. Genesis chapter 15, we see that the word of the Lord comes to Abram in a vision. And God says to him, "Fear not, Abram. I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward." And Abram, he comes back and, okay, you're my great reward. What will you give me, seeing I go childless? In verse 4, it says, "The word of the Lord came to him, saying, This shall not be thine heir." That is this servant that he has, which was the only heir he had at the time. God says it's not going to be him, but he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. And God brings him forth abroad. He tells him to look at the heaven and count the stars if he's able to. And he says to him, so shall thy seed be. And there we have that famous verse there, and he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Clear indication of the righteousness of God, which is by faith. And as we continue down here, something happens. Something really important. It may sound strange to us today, but in that time, in that culture, this was something serious. This was a covenant. And God tells him to take an heifer of 3 years old, a she-goat of 3 years old, a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. Take them. He took them and divided them. He cut them in half. And he laid the pieces one against the other. Sounds pretty morbid, pretty crazy today, but this was the way people dealt with in those days with a covenant. And so we see here, this was initiated by God. God is about to enter into this covenant here. And verse 12, the sun goes down, deep sleep falls upon him, and a horror of great darkness falls on him. And then God speaks to Abram and says, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge. And afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. We see all the way back here, we see God revealing the history here already of what's going to happen. Abraham was not going to necessarily see the whole fulfillment of these promises. He was not going to see these great nations. There was Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac was the promised seed. That was it. That's one man. And then from Isaac, Jacob and Esau. That's it. Then Jacob, we started to get a little more. But it's not some great nation just yet. But God reveals to him what they're going to go through. And we know, of course, that this is fulfilled out when they're in Egypt. So Abram already knew of these things. These are things perhaps he passed on to Isaac. In Genesis chapter 21, Genesis chapter 21, we see that God then reveals what we read there in Hebrews, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And that's the account of it where after Isaac's birth, there's this feast that he has. He's being weaned, and Ishmael is mocking him, and Sarah sees this, and she says, no, he's not going to be the heir. He needs to be cast out. And Abraham's grieved over this. But God reveals to him that it will be in Isaac. Now, this was perhaps most likely passed on to Isaac. He recognized this. He was there. We already spoke on it and thought on this of that sacrifice. He experienced that. He was there. And what experience that would have been from Isaac's perspective. All that had happened, and then God calling out of heaven and witnessing that. And that proclamation after Abraham sees the ram caught in the thicket and says, God will provide. These are things that are being passed on that Isaac is hearing about, no doubt. And then in Genesis chapter 25, starting at verse 21, it seems that Isaac's wife, just similar to Sarah, is having trouble having children. And Isaac entreats the Lord for her because of this. And it says here that the Lord was entreated of him. We see Isaac is turning to the Lord and requesting this of him. He's recognizing that this is within his power. We see something of Isaac's faith even here in this prayer. And the Lord hears him, and it says Rebekah, his wife, conceived. And as we continue on reading here, we see something that God reveals even further. She's conceived, and the children are struggling in her. And she's saying, if it be so, why am I thus? And so she inquires of the Lord, and the Lord speaks to her. He says, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. God revealed this before their birth. We see again this intention and purpose behind, purpose that God has, and these promises that are wrapped up in this Abrahamic covenant, this promise that God gave originally to Abraham. In thy seed, in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And now we see God saying something of Isaac's seed after this with these twins. The elder shall serve the younger. We know about the story about Isaac, and he was a little bit weak. It seems that he was not necessarily so willing at first to go along with God's plan. He heard these things, no doubt, from his father. He knew, no doubt, of this revelation about Jacob, who was the younger, and Esau, who was the elder, and how the elder would serve the younger. The common practice in those days regarding the blessing and so forth was that those things would be given to the elder, but God clearly had a purpose against that tradition. Yet Isaac didn't want to let go of it. He liked what Esau gave to him in the meat, and he wanted to bless him. Sometimes we're weak. Sometimes we know God's purposes, we know his plans, we know what he's promised, and we know what he's told us to do, but we're weak. Sometimes we want to do things our own way. And what's really nice about these people that are being pointed out here in Hebrews 11, such as Isaac, is that though we're weak, though we sin, though we falter, that it has pleased God, that it is by faith we receive his grace, that he would send his son to take the punishment for sin in our place and justify us. And so while we may mess up, we may slip, we can look to Jesus. We can be reminded of the promises that he has given us, and we can hold to that faith. Isaac, though he was weak, though he did not want to go along with this, eventually we see that's what he goes with. He surrenders. We read about this blessing here in Genesis 27. If you drop down to verse 26, it says, Isaac says to him, and that is Jacob, "Kiss me, my son, come near." And so he comes near, he kisses him, and Isaac smells the smell of his garment, which was Esau's garment that his mother had him wear. And Isaac says, "See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field which the Lord hath blessed. Therefore, God give thee of the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of corn and wine. Let people serve thee, and nations bow down to thee. Be Lord over thy brethren, and let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be everyone that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee." And we see that was what was said of Abraham, the promise that was given to him and to Isaac. And now he's giving it here to Jacob, thinking it's Esau. We know the story. Jacob leaves. Esau comes back, right? There in verse 30 and verse 32, Isaac says, "Who art thou?" And he said, "I'm thy son, thy firstborn Esau." And verse 33, Isaac trembled very exceedingly. He said, "Who?" And he realizes what happens. And he says to Esau, after he asks him, "Where is he that hath taken venison and brought it to me, and have eaten all before thou camest, and have blessed him?" He says, "Yea, and he shall be blessed." And Esau pleads with him for a blessing. And what Isaac eventually gives to him in verse 39, he says, "Behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth, and the dew of the heaven from above. And by thy sword shalt thou live, and shalt serve thy brother. And it shall come to pass, when thou shalt have the dominion, that thou shalt break his yoke from off thy neck." Drop down to chapter 28, verse 1. Isaac calls Jacob again after all this has occurred, and he blesses him and charges him, tells him not to take a wife of the daughters of Canaan, tells him where to go. And he says in verse 3, "God Almighty bless thee, and make thee fruitful, and multiply thee, that thou mayest be a multitude of people, and give thee the blessing of Abraham to thee and to thy seed with thee, that thou mayest inherit the land wherein thou art a stranger, which God gave unto Abraham." We see Isaac eventually, in faith, blesses concerning things to come. I would continue going on here with Jacob and Joseph. We don't have the time for that now, but it's my prayer that as we look back at these accounts and we see this, that we see what the nature of our faith, true, genuine, saving faith, needs to be. The hope, the joy that is to be had in that. And though we may be weak, though we may falter, the danger that exists in falling away, the utter folly of casting such precious faith away to the dust, that we would be strengthened and reminded of these things, to hold on and persevere even though things may not appear to be going according to plan, to trust confidently in the faithful and almighty God who has promised. All right, with that, I guess we'll go ahead and give our last song here, "Standing on the Promises."